World of Warcraft. Tides of Darkness by Aaron Rosenberg. Chapter 21.
The humans are here!
Doomhammer glanced up from his reprieve, annoyed at the fear that he heard in Thurbuck's voice. When had his fierce sub-chieftain become so weak?
I know they are here,
he growled in reply, standing and glancing behind the other orc. They were standing upon a rough ledge that had been carved from the mountaintop, in front of the fortress itself and high above the rocky plain, and from here he could see the remaining horde spread below. The last time he had this advantage, his warriors had carpeted the plain below, leaving not a hint of rock beneath. Now there were large patches of black rock between the green and brown, and he could pick out each family where it groups together, slightly apart from the rest. When had his horde grown so thin? What had he led them to? Why did he not listen to Duratar sooner and heeded his old friend's words? Everything he had been warned about was coming true.
What do we do?
Thurbeck demanded, stepping up behind him.
We do not have the numbers to repel them anymore.
Doomhammer glared at his second so fiercely the other orc backed away. It was true. They were fewer now, and that their forces were no longer so numerous as to blanket the world. But they were still orcs by the ancestors.
What do we do?
He hissed at his lieutenant, pulling his hammer from his place in the back.
We fight, of course!
Turning away from the quivering Thurbeck, Doomhammer stepped further onto the ledge.
Hear me, my people!
He bellowed, raising his hammer high. Some turned to look up, but others did not, and that incensed him. He struck the cliff face a mighty blow with his weapon, and the resounding crack brought him the horde's immediate and undivided attention.
Hear me!
He shouted again.
I know we have suffered defeats and setbacks, and our numbers are sorely diminished. I know that Gul'dan's treachery has cost us dearly, but still, we are orcs! Still, we are the Horde, and our footsteps shall shake this world.
A cheer rose from the warriors below, but it was ragged and weak.
The humans have followed us to this place,
he continued, spinning each word as if it disgusted him, which it did.
They think us beaten. They think we came here because we are fleeing their might, as a dog would flee its master. But they are wrong.
He raised his hammer high again.
We came here because this is our stronghold, our place of strength. We came here because from here we can spill forth once more, covering this land with our steps. We came here so that we might pour out upon them again and make them once more tremble at our name.
This time the cheer was louder, and Doomhammer let it wash over him. The warriors were standing and waving their weapons aloft, and he could tell they were getting worked up again. Good.
We will not wait for them to come upon us, he told his people. We will not sit here idly and let them decide to battle. No, we are orcs. We are the Horde. And we will bring the fight to them, and they will learn to regret ever pursuing us here. And when we have crushed them beneath us, we will march back over their corpses and once more claim their lands as our own.
He held his hammer over him with both hands, swinging about above his head, and the cheer now shook the rocks and the very stone upon which he stood. Doomhammer felt a smile crease his face, and exulted in it. These were his people. They would not go down sniveling and pleading. If they fell, it would be in battle, and with blood on their hands.
Ready the warriors,
he told his stunned Thurbeck.
My elite guard and I will lead the charge ourselves. The rest of the Horde will follow.
Turning, Doomhammer glanced at the bulky figures that stood in the shadow, waiting. Each of them straightened and nodded as he caught their gaze, and Doomhammer nodded in return. These were his elite guard, and they were all ogres. Doomhammer was a proper orc, and had been raised to hate the ogres, but these were different. They were more intelligent than most of their kind, for one, but they were warriors and not warlocks. Equally as important, they were intensely loyal to him, and him alone. He knew they admired his strength and courage. They seemed to see him as a small ogre himself, and had pledged themselves to his personal command. He, in turn, had come to respect their strength and rely upon their support. He knew they would die for him if necessary, and was surprised to realize he would give his life for them as well. And now, they would all risk their lives as the Horde's victory hung in the balance. At least the portal was safe. Random Main Blackhand had survived the battle with Gul'dan and an attack by the Alliance fleet, along with some of their other clanmates. They had sent a scout to Doomhammer, finding him on the way here from Khaz-Modan, and he had ordered them to join the rest of their clan at the portal. He still did not trust the brothers, but they'd proven themselves loyal to the Horde at least, and he needed strong warriors to protect their access to Draenor. Not that he would ever consider fleeing, even if the battle turned against them. He nodded at his ogres once again. Then he made his way off the ledge, leading down toward the plain below and the battle that awaited them. The Alliance was not prepared for the Orcs to attack, just as Doomhammer had hoped. The humans had positioned themselves for a siege, expecting to wait the Orcs out and take any loose lone warriors foolish enough to show themselves beyond the protective cliffs that ringed Black Rock Mountain itself. Doomhammer's charge took them completely by surprise. "Orcs!" a soldier shouted, running back to where Lothar and his lieutenant stood. "They've overrun our position!" "What?" Lothar kicked his steed into motion and galloped across the Black Valley, where he had stationed a bulk of the Alliance troops. Tyralion and the others followed close behind. Sure enough, as he approached the front lines, he heard the unmistakable sounds of battle. Then he saw them. There were orcs, but orcs like he had never seen. These were massive creatures with thick arms and stout legs, and their hair was worn in spikes that rose above them like birds' crest or horse mane. The orcs had no armor, wearing only loincloths and shoulder pads and furry boots, and wielded their weapons with mad abandon, hacking and stabbing everything within their reach. Their green skin was heavily tattooed, and most of them had jagged bits of metal or small bits of what looked like bone shoved through ears, nose, brows, lips, and even nipples. They were savages, and the men were falling back before their forthing attack. "Uther!" Lothar shouted, and the paladin strode forward. He lowered his sword, indicating the orcs, and that was enough. The paladin nodded, beckoning the other members of the Silver Hand to follow him as he lowered his helm and raised his warhammer. "By the holy lights!" Uther shouted, a glow springing up from him and around his weapon. "We shall not suffer such beasts to live." And he drove into the fray, his hammer slamming down upon the nearest orc's head and shattering its skull. The sky here was always thick with cloud and soot, casting heavy shadows and blood-tinged light upon everything, but not now. The clouds parted, and a beam of pure sunlight lanced down, lining Uther as he waded into the assembled horde. The paladins became a figure of pure light, awesome and terrifying, his every blow crushing orc warriors left and right. The other paladins joined him, his light suffusing them as well. The Silver Hand had expanded in the months since the war began, and now numbered 12 under Uther's command, and not counting Tyralion. Those 12 waded into the combat, their hammers and axes and swords glowing with their faith, and the rest of the Alliance soldiers pulled back to give them space. The orcs turned and faced a new foe. It was a brutal battle. Savages versus zealots, shining mail against tattoos and piercings. The orcs were strong, tough, and crazed enough to not notice pain, but the paladins were filled with righteous anger and the power of their faith, and their holy auras caused more than one orc to turn away when attacking. With this advantage, the paladins ringed the savage orcs, cutting down one after another until the last lay dead at their feet. "Good work," Lothar was saying when another sentry ran up to him. "What now?" he wondered wearily. "Another attack?" "Another attack!" the soldier gasped, echoing his thoughts. This time, to the west!" "Damn them!" Lothar murmured, spurring his horse again and racing toward the new location. They were smart, he had to give him that. He had not expected an attack, and his men were not ready for it. Most of them had relaxed, counting on a long, slow siege. Some had even removed their armor, though he had ordered them to stay alert, just in case. Now, they were paying the price for their laxity. And if the orcs were able to weaken enough spots along their line with their sudden attacks, they could break through and escape to the rest of the mountain range. It would take months, even years, to track all of them down, and that would give the horde time to rebuild and retry. He could not let that happen. He burst onto the new battle, trampling an orc that did not move aside quick enough, and then wheeled his horse around and reined in, studying the situation. This was a much larger attack than the last one, a full 60 of them or more. Even more daunting were the 6 ogres in their mix. They fought savagely, but not as mindless as the last attackers, and showed some sense of tactic, particularly the giant orc in their mix, whose long hair hung in ornate braids that danced as he swung a massive black hammer left and right, crushing alliance soldiers with each blow, sometimes about the way the giant moved, quickly but carefully, even gracefully, despite the massive black plate armor encrusting him, struck Lothar. This, he somehow knew, was their leader. He was urging his horse into the fray when the giant glanced up and looked right at him. Those eyes were not the glowing red Lothar had grown accustomed to seeing in his foes. They were gray and full of intelligence, and they widened slightly, as if in recognition. "There!" Doomhammer grinned as he studied the large human perched on a horse nearby. That one, the one with the shield and the enormous sword and the clever sea blue eyes. He was their leader. He was the one Doomhammer had been hoping to find. If he could take out this man, the army's resolve would crumble. "Move aside!" Doomhammer bellowed, smashing a human soldier in his path and kicking one of his own orcs out of the way as well. The man he saw was charging into the fray as well, laying about him with that sword, barely looking at the carnage he was creating. The human leader's eyes were locked on him. Combat raged all around him, but Doomhammer kept his own gaze fixed on his foe. He stalked forward, his hammer clearing space through the crush of bodies, not caring if he struck orc or human. All that mattered was reaching that man. The human was only slightly more careful, not actively striking any of his own people, but expecting them to dodge his horse and his blows all the same. Finally, there were no more warriors between them, and Doomhammer faced the man at close range. Mounted, the human had the advantage. Doomhammer solved that problem at once. His hammer arced out, its massive stone head smashing full force into the horse's head. The steed collapsed, blood pouring from its shattered skull, its legs twitching. The human did not fall. Instead, he kicked free of his stirrups and leapt to one side as the horse fell, then hurled the body to confront Doomhammer directly. The rest of the battle faded away as the two leaders raised their weapons and collided without words, each intent upon only one thing: the other's death. The Titanic Battle. Lothar was a large, powerful man, easily as big and as strong as most orc warriors, but Doomhammer was larger still, and stronger, and younger. What Lothar lacked in youth and speed, however, he made up for in skill and experience. Both wore heavy plate armor and battered mail of Stormwind versus the black plate armor of the Horde, and both carried weapons lesser warriors could never have wielded: the glittering rune-etched blade of Stormwind and the black stone hammer of Doomhammer line. And both were determined to win, no matter the cost. Lothar struck first. His sword swept in from the side, angling suddenly to weave below Doomhammer's block and curve ferociously in the orc's heavy armor. The Horde warchief grunted from the impact and retaliated by bringing his hammer down fast, missing Lothar only because the champion danced back a step. But Doomhammer reversed his grip suddenly and swept the weapon back up, catching Lothar a glancing blow under the chin and sending him stumbling backwards. A quick hammer blow followed, but Lothar brought his sword up in time to block it, catching the heavy weapon on its handle. For a second, the two warriors struggled, Doomhammer to bring his hammer down and Lothar to knock it aside, and the weapons quivered but did not move. Then, Lothar twisted his blade and succeeded in sending the hammer wide. He stepped in close while Doomhammer was bringing the massive weapon back around and struck the orc in the face with the flat of his blade, stunning the warchief for an instant. But Doomhammer lashed out with his free hand, catching Lothar a ringing blow in the neck, and regained his weapon and his composure while the Alliance commander staggered from the impact. Turalian was battling orcs of his own, but a powerful hammer blow dropped one opponent, and over the falling warrior, he saw Lothar and the massive orc locked in battle. "No!" Turalian shouted, seeing his leader and hero facing the monster's black-armored orc. He began striking with renewed force, his hammer crushing orcs with each sweeping blow as he desperately fought his way toward the two commanders. They both stepped in again, hammer and sword swinging. Lothar took Doomhammer's hit full upon his lion-head shield, which crumbled from the impact and nearly drove him to his knees, but his sword caught the orc hard across the chest and dented the heavy breastplate deeply. Doomhammer stepped back, his lips pulling back in a snarl of pain and frustration, and ripped the ruined armor from his torso, just as Lothar rose to his feet again and tossed his useless shield to the side. Then both bellowed and charged again. Doomhammer was faster now without the armor, but Lothar had his sword in both hands and could dance it around the orc's defenses. Both took solid blows. Doomhammer a nasty gash across his stomach, and Lothar a heavy blow to his right side, and both staggered slightly as they parted for a third time. Around them, the other orcs and humans fought their own savage battles as the two powerful leaders struck out again and again, each seeking a weak point in his opponent's defenses, each delivering punishing attacks and receiving them in return. The two closed again, and Doomhammer slammed Lothar in the chest with one heavy fist, the impact rocking the champion on his heels and denting his breastplate. Before he could recover fully, Doomhammer stepped back himself and brought his massive hammer down with both hands, all his strength behind the blow. Lothar swung his sword up to block the vicious attack and took the full force of the swing upon his blade, which shattered from the impact. A gasp escaped Turalian as pieces of the legendary sword fell to the ground, and Doomhammer's blow, now unimpeded, continued to glitter downward, striking the top of Lothar's helm, which, with a sickening crunch, the Lion of Azeroth swayed, bringing his rune sword down reflexively, and laid open Doomhammer's chest with a jagged half-blade before collapsing himself. There was an utter silence as both sides stopped fighting and stared at the Alliance commander, splayed upon the ground, his body twitching as the life fled him. And then, nothing moved save the pool of blood spurting rapidly beneath his ruined head. Doomhammer took an unsteady step, one hand pressed against the gaping wound across his torso, blood leaking around his fingers, but still he stood straight, and with an effort raised his hammer high above his head.
"I have conquered,"
he proclaimed with a hoarse whisper, swaying and spitting blood, but still victorious.
"And so, all our foes die until your world belongs to us."
Chapter 22.
"No!"
The words burst from Turalian's lips as he shoved through the crowd and dropped to his knees beside the dead body of his hero, his mentor, his commander. Then his gaze switched to the orc towering above him, and something within him clicked into place. For months, Turalian had been struggling with his faith and with one particular question. How could the holy light unite all creatures and souls when something so monstrous as cruel and purely evil as the orc horde walked this world? Unable to reconcile the two, he had been unsure of himself and of the church's teachings, and had looked on with envy as Uther and the other paladins gave blessings and shone bright with zeal, knowing he could not match their ability. But something this Doomhammer, had just said had registered on some level below consciousness thought, and Turalian tried to trace it.
"Until your world belongs to us,"
the Horde war chief had gloated. Your world, not our world, or even this world. And that was the answer. He had remembered the dark portal, of course. Khadgar had told him about it when they had first met, while describing the orc menace, and it had been mentioned several times since then. But for some reason, the truth of it had never really stuck in, until now. The orcs were not of this world. They were foreign to this planet, to the very plane of existence. They came from elsewhere and were powered by demons from even further beyond. The holy light did unite all life, everyone in this world, but not the orcs who did not belong here. And that meant his task was clear. He was charged with upholding the holy light and using its blazing glory to scour this world clean of all threats from without, and to maintain the purity within. The orcs did not belong here, and that meant he could strike them down with impunity.
"By the light, your time here has ended," he shouted, rising to his feet. A brilliant glow sprang around him, so bright orcs and humans alike turned away, shielding their eyes. "You are not of this world, not of the holy light. You do not belong here. Be gone."
The Orc war chief grimaced and backed away a step, a hand shielding his eyes. Turalian took advantage of the moment to crouch again beside Lothar's body. "Go with the light, my friend," he whispered, touching the forefinger of the fallen champions. shattered forehead, his own tears dripping down to mix with the dead warrior's blood. You have earned a place among the holy, and the light welcomes you into its loving embrace. An aura sprang up around the body, glowing with a pure white, and he thought the features of his dead friend relaxed slightly, growing calm, even quietly content. Then Trollian rose again, and now he held in one hand the shattered greatsword. "And you, foul creature," he declared, turning towards the dazzled Doomhammer, "you will pay for your crimes upon this world and its peoples." Doomhammer must have recognized the threat in his tone, for the orc leader gripped his hammer with both hands and swung it up, blocking the blow he sensed was coming. But Trollian had both hands wrapped around the broken sword hilt and brought the blade down in a blinding flash of light. And the ruined weapon slammed hard into the massive warhammer's black stone head, the impact traveling down the heavy wooden handle and shaking it free of its master's grip. The hammer fell harmlessly to the side. Doomhammer's eyes widened as he realized what had happened, and then he closed them and gave a faint nod, waiting for the rest of the blow to fall. But the Tyrallian had turned the blade at the last second and struck the orc with a flat instead of the edge. The impact drove Doomhammer to his knees, and then he collapsed alongside Lothar. But Tyrallian could see the rise and fall of the warchief's back. "You will stand trial for your crimes," he told the unconscious orc, the light building around him. "You will stand in Capital City in chains." It was brighter than the brightest day now, and every orc turned away, cowering from the blinding light. "And as a leader of the Alliance, decide your fate, and there you will acknowledge your full defeat." Then he turned and glanced up, this time at the other orc warriors. He stood frozen as they had watched their leader's apparent victory converted to stunning defeat. "But you will not be so lucky," Tyrallian intoned, leveling the shattered sword at them. Light lanced from it, and from his hand, his head, his eyes, the black rock around him was bleached white by the power that poured from his body. "You will die here with the rest of your kind, and this world will be rid of your taint forever." And with that, he leaped forward, with the sun-bright blade already in motion. It caught the first orc in the throat before he could even react, and the brute fell, blood spurting from the wound as Tyrallian charged past him toward the other half-blinded horde warriors. That broke the paralysis, and the other orcs and humans finally were able to move again. Uthar and the other Silver Hand Paladins joined the throng during Lothar and Doomhammer's battle, and now they ran forward to follow their fellow, auras springing up around them as well as they drove into the gathering horde. The rest of the Lion's forces followed. The battle that followed was surprisingly quick. Many of the orcs had seen Doomhammer's defeat, and their leaders collapsed, sending them into panic. Many fled. Others dropped their weapons and surrendered. These were rounded up for imprisonment, and despite their earlier statement, Tyrallian found he did not have it within him to kill helpless prisoners, no matter what they had done beforehand. Many did stand and fight, of course, but they were disorganized and dazed, and proved little match for the resolute Alliance soldiers. "A band of them, perhaps 400 strong, is fleeing south through the Red Ridge Mountains," Kagar reported an hour later, after the combat had ended and the valley had grown quiet, save for the rustling of men, the moans of wounded, and the growling of the prisoners. "Good," Tyrallian replied. He was tearing a long strip from his cloak and wrapping it around his waist as a sash, then struck Lothar's shattered sword through it. "Form up ranks and pursue them, but not too quickly. Let the unit leaders know we do not want to catch them." "We don't?" Tyrallian turned and looked at his friend, reminding himself again that for all his talents, the mage was no tactician. "Where is this dark portal that leads back to the Orcs' homeworld?" he asked. Kagar shrugged. "We don't know exactly," he admitted. "Somewhere in the swamplands." "And now that horde has suffered an undeniable defeat. Where will those few survivors go?" The old-seeming mage grinned. "Back home." "Exactly." Tyrallian straightened, "and we will follow them back to this portal and destroy it once and for all." Kagar nodded and turned to seek the unit leaders, but stopped as Uther approached them. "There are no orcs left, save for those who have given themselves to our custody. the paladin announced. Tarali nodded. Good work. A handful escaped, but we will pursue them and destroy or capture them as well. Lothar studied him. You have assumed command, he said softly. I suppose I have. Taralian considered it. He hadn't really thought about it before. He had simply gotten used to giving orders for the army, both at Lothar's request and when the commander was in the hinterlands with the rest of the troops. Now he shrugged. If you prefer, we can send a griffin rider Lordaeron and ask King Tyrannus and the other kings who should assume command. There's no need, Khadgar said, stepping back and to stand beside him. You were Lothar's lieutenant and sub-commander. You were given charge of half the army when we divided our forces. You are the only choice to command now that he is gone. The mage turned towards Uther with a glare, clearly daring him to contradict the statement. But to Taralian's surprise, Uther nodded. It is so, he agreed. You are our commander, and we will follow your lead as we did Lord Lothar's. Then he moved closer and rested a friendly hand on Taralian's shoulder. And I am happy I was to see your faith finally emerge, my brother. The compliment seemed genuine, and Taralian smiled, pleased to have the older paladin's approval. And I thank you, Uther, the Lightbringer, Taralian replied, and he saw the other paladin's eyes widen at the new title. For so shall you be known henceforth, in honor of the holy light you brought us this day. Uther bowed, clearly pleased, then turned without another word and walked back towards the other knights of the Silver Hand, no doubt to tell them their marching orders. I thought he'd argue for control, Khadgar said quietly. He doesn't want it, Taralian replied, still watching Uther. He wants to lead, yes, but only by example. He's comfortable leading the Order only because they're paladins as well. And you? His friend asked bluntly. Are you comfortable leading us all? Taralian pondered that, then shrugged. I don't feel I've earned it, but I know Lothar trusted me with it. And I believe in him and his judgment. He nodded and met Khadgar's gaze. Now, let's be after those orcs. It took them a week to reach what Khadgar said were called the Swamp of Sorrow. They could have moved more quickly, but Taralian had cautioned his soldiers not to overtake the orcs yet. They needed to know the location of the portal first. Then they could strike. Lothar's death had shocked everyone, but it also galvanized them. Men who had been wary were now focused hard and resolute. They had all taken the loss of their commander personally and seemed determined to avenge his death. And they all accepted Taralian as his chosen successor, especially those who had followed him to quell Philosophy back. Sogging through the marshes was difficult and unpleasant. But other than murmuring a little, no one complained. The scouts kept the orcs in sight and then reported back, allowing the Alliance troops to move at a slow pace and still not worry about losing their quarry. The Horde remnant was in general disarray, all the orcs heading in the same direction but not marching together, simply jogging or walking at their own pace, and with a handful of companions amid their larger group. Taralian just hoped that remained the case. He assumed the Horde leader that Doomhammer had left troops and a lieutenant in charge of the portal itself. If their leader was strong enough, he could fuse the defeated orcs back to a solid fighting force, along with whatever warriors he had with him already. Taralian warned his lieutenants to keep the men alert and not let them get complacent, assuming this would be an easy fight, could get them all killed. They spent another week in the swamps before finally reaching the area called the Black Morass, but here even Khadgar was in for a surprise. I do not understand, the mage commented, crouching to study the ground. This should all be marsh. It should be just like what we've already been through, soggy, filthy, and smelly. He tapped the hard red stone before him and frowned. This is definitely not right. It looks almost indigenous, said Bran Bronzebeard, who stood beside him. The dwarves had insisted on accompanying them the rest of the way, and Taralian had been glad for both their battle prowess and their company. He found he liked the two brothers, with their bluff, good cheer, and their equal appreciation for a good fight and good ale, and a fine woman. Bran was certainly the more scholarly of the two, and he and Khadgar had spent several evenings talking about obscure texts while the rest of them discussed less academic subjects. And all the dwarves from Ironforge were experts on rocks and gems, so for Bran to not recognize the rock beneath them was unsettling, to say the least. "But no fire I know could do this," he added, scraping at it with one blunt fingernail, "and certainly not in such a large expanse." The redstone stretched ahead of them as far as they could see. "I'd never seen anything like." "Unfortunately, I have," Khadgar replied, standing again. "But not of this world." He did not explain further, and something in the expression warned the others not to press him. Murden started to ask anyway, but his brother stopped him. "Do you know what your name means in Dwarven, lad?" Bran asked Khadgar. "It means trust." The mage nodded. "We trust you, lad. You'll tell us when you're ready." "Well, it's almost certainly tied to the orcs," Trollian pointed out, and we'll have an easier time pursuing them across the stone than we would wading through more marshland, so I'm not opposed to the change in scenery." The others nodded, though Khadgar still looked thoughtful, and they mounted up again and continued on. A few nights later, Khadgar glanced up from the campfire and suddenly announced, "I think we have a problem." The others all turned to listen to the young old mage. "I've consulted with the other magi, and we think we know what's causing the ground to change," he explained. "It's the dark portal itself. Its very presence is affecting our world, starting with the land immediately around it, and I think it's spreading." Why would this portal cause such an alteration?" Uther asked. The Silverhand leader had never been very comfortable with magi, sharing the common perception that their magic was unholy and possibly even demonic. But he had learned to at least accept and possibly even respect Khadgar during the Long War. But the mage shook his head. "I'd have to see it to be certain," he replied. "But I guess the portal is linking our two worlds, and this one and the Orcs' homeworld of Draenor. And it's doing more than just forming a bridge. Somehow it's melding the two together, at least right at its entry point." "And the world is made of red stone?" Bran guessed. "Not entirely," Khadgar answered. "Some time ago I had a vision of Draenor. However, and what I saw of it was a bleak place. Ground much like this. There's little life left there, and if nature itself had been stripped away, I think it may be their magics which tainted the land itself. That taint is spreading through the portal, and every time these orcs use their magic here, it grows worse." "All the more reason to destroy it, then," Trollian announced, "and the sooner the better." His friend nodded. "Yes, I agree. The sooner the better." It was 3 more days before the scouts came back and announced that the orcs had stopped moving. "They're all holed up in a large valley just ahead," one of them announced, "and there is some kind of gateway in the center." Khadgar exchanged a glance with Turali Uthar and Bronzebeard brothers. That had to be the dark portal. "Tell the men," Turalian said softly, drawing Lothar's broken sword with one hand and hefting his own hammer with the other. "We attack at once." Khadgar marveled once again at the changes in the last few months had caused in his friend. Turalian had been more stern, more commanding, more sure of himself. He had gone from being an untried youth to a seasoned warrior and an experienced commander. But since Lothar's death, he had also had an aura about him, a sense of calm and wisdom, and even majesty. Uther and the other paladins had similar feelings, but more removed as they were above the problems of this world. Trollian seemed to be more at one with the world around him, more attuned to his surroundings. It was a magic Khadgar did not understand, but one he respected a great deal. In many ways, it was the opposite of his own magic, which sought to control the elements and other forces. Trollian was not controlling anything, but by opening himself to those same forces, he gained the ability to tap them, with less control, but more subtlety than any mage. The soldiers were readied, and they all crept forward, leading their horses to keep them at least quieter on the hard red stone. The ground rose up slightly and then dipped absurdly into a deep valley whose far walls reared even higher. At the center of the valley, as the scout had said, stood a massive gateway, not set in any wall or structure, but freestanding. And Khadgar gasped as he saw it fully. The dark portal. It could hardly be anything else. It was easily 100 feet high and almost as wide, and was crafted from some greenish-gray stone. It had harsh, swirling patterns carved on either side, each base around the scowling skull with two wickedly curved barbs along the outer edges. The centerpiece had a crude ornamental border below, but was plain and unmarked above. 4 wide steps led up to the portal itself, which glowed green and black and cracked with energy. And to Khadgar's senses, it was a maelstrom, radiating power and a strange sense of vast distance. He could also feel it reaching out, digging into the land and pulling tendrils of energy into its gaping maw. The orcs were milling about before the portal as if unsure what to do now. There were more here than they had been following, so clearly Tauralian had been right. Doomhammer had left the orcs here to guard the place, but the Alliance still outnumbered them, and the orcs were separated into distinct clusters as if they no longer had reason to trust one another, and so had reverted to their own families and hunting parties. This was not an army, but a collection of small bands. "Now!" Tauralian shouted as he leapt over the edge of the cliff and slid down the long slope, landing almost on top of several orcs sitting there. Lothor's sword stabbed forward, impaling one orc on its jagged half-length, and then Tauralian's hammer struck another orc, crushing the skull and sending him critting to the first, who fell free of the sword and toppled to the ground. Then Uther and the rest of the paladins were there as well, flanking Tauralian as he stood and stalked toward the other orcs, and the rest of the Alliance was right behind them. Khadgar knew he was less useful in battle than wielding his magic, so he stayed upon the cliff with the other magi, watching the fight as it was quick and decisive. Lothar and Tauralian had forged the Alliance troops into a powerful united force, and it fought as one now, with the men working together against a common foe. Pikemen were defending by swordmen and axe wielders, and the archers watched over all of them, providing range support as needed. The orcs were too disorganized to work together, and each cluster stood and fought alone. That made it easy for Tauralian to send his men surrounded one orc band at a time, and either slaughter them or take them prisoner. He worked his way methodically across the valley, defeating orc after orc, and as many hauled in chains as lay dead upon the ground. By this time, a large number of orcs, death knights, and others had fled through the portal rather than face death or capture. Only a small ragged group remained behind, standing its ground to cover the others' retreat. Finally, Tauralian had reached the bottom of the portal's bottom step. 2 stocky, muscular orcs stood on top each step, each wielding massive, jagged axes. They had metals and bones hanging from their hair, their nose, their ears, their brows, and all over their armor, and their hair rose in a single mass of short, dark spikes on top of their heads, as if those two were weapons. One of the orcs had a blood-stained bandage around his left shoulder and leg. Nevertheless, both orcs seemed arrogant and confident of victory, evidently unmoved by their leader's recent defeat.
"You face Red and Mane, Black Hand of the Blacktooth Green," one of them shouted as they stomped down the steps towards Tauralian. "Our father Blackhand led the horde until the upstart Doomhammer slew him unjustly. Now he's gone, we will build the horde until it's even larger than before, and we will smash you out of existence."
"I think not," Tauralian replied, his words ringing across the valley against the black backdrop of the portal's swirling energy. He glowed a brilliant white, small and piercing. "Your leader is captured, your army destroyed, your clans in disarray, and what remains of your horde gather here in this one valley which we have surrounded." He raised both hammer and sword. "Face me if you dare, or turn and flee back to your own world and never return." The taunt worked, and the 2 brothers charged down the last step, leaping upon Tauralian with fierce battle cries. But the young paladin and recent commander did not flinch. He took a quick step back and brought both hammer and sword down hard, knocking the orc's axes down to the ground. Then he closed again, and swept his own weapons back up, catching both orcs under the chin. The one to the left staggered back a pace, stunned, but his brother reeled, blood flying from the deep cut beneath his chin. As Khadgar watched, the two orcs growled and lashed out again, but their attacks were clumsier this time, more wild, and Ceralion avoided them both by simply expedient of a darting forward between and past the two orcs. He struck them each in the stomach as he passed, doubling them over from the impact, and then kicked them both from behind, sending them trembling from the ramp to the hard stone ground. He was right behind them, his weapons whistling as they arced through the air. Unfortunately, the brothers were not alone.
Clansmates, to us!
One of the brothers bellowed.
Kill the human!
Two more orcs leapt into the fray, giving the Black Hands space to pull back. The brothers swung at some of the men approaching them, but to Khadgar, their blows seemed half-hearted. They had clearly reconsidered their chances. A gap appeared in the Alliance forces approaching the portal, and the orc brothers took advantage of it and ran. A handful of their brethren followed their example, but Ceralion was too busy to chase after them. However, many of the other orcs remained to fight, some even spitting at and cursing the fleeing Black Hands, and the two who had moved to the Black Hands' aid were still menacing Ceralion himself.
Ah!
One of the newcomers growled, sweeping out with his axe. Ceralion blocked the blow with his hammer and battered the heavy orc aside, then stabbed in with the broken sword, the blade piercing armor and flesh alike, and driving deep into the orc's middle. The orc dropped his weapon and stiffened, gasping at his hands as his hands clutched the blood-slick blade. Then he crumbled to the ground, his eyes already glazing over.
Die!
The other orc howled and threw himself at Ceralion. But Ceralion had pulled the sword free, the first orc, and now swung it at the second, catching him in the throat with a jagged tip. It was not enough to stop the charging warrior, but Ceralion knocked his axe blow aside with the hammer, and then swung again, the heavy hammer connecting solidly with the orc's head. The impact must have been tremendous, because the orc warrior collapsed, blood pouring from his shattered temple, and did not move again. Ceralion glanced down at the two dead bodies for a second, and then toward the Black Hands disappearing at the far edge of the valley. Then he looked up toward the ledge until he spotted Khadgar.
Do it now!
The paladin shouted, pointing Lothor's blade at the portal. Destroy it!
Get back!
Khadgar shouted in reply. I don't know what will happen. He barely noticed his friend nodding and trying to clear the massive stone structure. Instead, he and the 11 magi with him were already concentrating on the object. He could feel its power, and its link to both this world and Draenor, and the rift it had fashioned to allow access between the two. The rift would simply swallow their magic, he suspected, and the worlds themselves were too large and too powerful for them to affect, even if all of them together. Which left the physical gate itself, because no matter how powerful it was, stone was still stone, and stone could be shattered. Concentrating, Khadgar summoned the power to himself, filling himself with a magical might. There was little power left in these lands, but the dark portal itself had ample energy and nothing to safeguard that reservoir, to prevent people like the Magi from tapping that power for their own ends. Khadgar and the other Magi did so now, draining the portal's reserves utterly and directing all the energies to Khadgar himself. His hair stood on end, and energy crackled across his face and along his fingers. The wind howled around him, and he thought he saw lightning nearby, though it could have simply been the energy arcing across, even through his eyes. He just hoped it was enough. Facing the dark portal, Khadgar closed his eyes and opened his arms wide. His hands turned palmed up. He gathered all the magic he had just absorbed, every last bit of it, and bound it to something like a mystic ball that hung, pulsing and beaming before his eyes. He could feel the ball, feel how it throbbed, and feel how loosely it was assembled. Perfect. He shifted his senses towards the portal, toward the energies there, and then he aligned himself with its position. Then at last, he opened his eyes and slammed his hands together, turning them at the last second so they met palm to palm. And the ball of energy was propelled forward, flattening and elongating and transforming from a simple sphere to a long, slim shape, very like a different kind of spear. A spear that lanced the portal right in the center, its energies pouring out into the dark portal and across the stone slabs that formed its sides and top. The explosion rocked most of the Alliance soldiers and many of the remaining orcs from their feet, and Khadgar himself staggered on his perch. But the portal's heavy linted and squared columns were blown apart. Fortunately for the Alliance forces nearby, the explosion drove most of the larger stone fragments into the portal's depths. Then the portal itself vanished, the rolling colors replaced by simple empty space, and Kagar felt the world draw breath again as whatever had bound it to Draenor snapped, ending the tug of that dying world and letting nature reassert itself. Glancing down, Kagar saw Turalian picking himself up off the ground. The paladin was covered with rock dust and small rock chips, but looked otherwise unharmed, and he glanced up at Kagar as he wiped the dust from his face, arms, and chest. "I don't think they'll be using that again," he called up, and they both laughed, their humor born of profound relief. The war was over, and the Alliance had won. The world was safe. Epilogue. "It will be an impressive monument," Turalian commended. He and Kagar sat on their horses near the cliff's edge, looking out over the same plain where Lothar had fought his final battle months before. The landscape was bleak, brutal, and harsh. All blackstone had hardened lava, except where fresh lava glowed red amid the shadows. The air was thick with ash and soot, and the sky seemed perpetually overcast. The mountains loomed like disapproving guardians. Blackrock's spire rose at the far end. "It will," Kagar agreed. "His sacrifice will always shine as a symbol of loyalty and bravery, even after other traces of this war have vanished." Turalian nodded, his gaze still focused upon the statue that was being raised before Blackrock's spire. Regent Lord Anduin Lothar, champion of Stormwind and the commander of the Alliance, stood with sword raised, shield at the ready, looking to the skies as if daring them to battle. He was dressed in full armor, but without his helm, and his strong features stared out across the valley, his gaze stern but kind. "At least it's over," Kagar said. It was true. The battle at the Dark Portal had been the last. Those few orcs who had survived had surrendered and been taken prisoner. No one was quite sure what to do with them, and for now they had been put to work hauling materials for Lothar's monument, an irony Turalian appreciated. Once this was done, perhaps the orcs would be set to do more hard labor elsewhere. He doubted they would be slaughtered, but neither could they be set loose in case they dreamed of creating a horde once more. Some, including the Blackhands, had escaped, but they lacked the numbers to pose a serious threat now. Still, that was not his concern. Taranis and the other kings would make that decision when the time came. After Lordaeron had been cleansed, Taranis had marched his forces to Alterac and declared martial law, opposing the traitorous Paranold and imprisoning him. Alterac's fate was still uncertain, but the alliance would continue, and the remaining monarchs had asked Turalian to remain as its commander. He had accepted, feeling Lothar would have wanted him to continue in that role. His friend and mentor had only wanted to protect the land and its people, and he vowed to do the same. "You're thinking heavy thoughts," Kagar mentioned, nudging him in the arm. "Only about the future and what it may bring," Turalian replied. "No one knows the future," his friend said, with a strange look across his face. "Though I suspect we have not seen the last of the Horde or its world." "I hope you're wrong," Turalian told him. "But if you're right, we will be here waiting for them when they return, and we will drive them back again, just as we did this time. This world is ours, and by the holy light we will keep it safe now and forever." The mage laughed. "A noble statement." "Good, Turalian," he teased. "Perhaps that is what they will carve on your statue when the time comes." "A statue?" Turalian laughed. "What could either of us do to possibly earn statues?" Acknowledgements. As always, massive thanks go to Chris for starting the tide and to Marco for controlling it. I'd also like to thank Evelyn for her sharp eyes and kind words. Most importantly, I'd like to thank the World of Warcraft fans, without whom Lothar and Orgrim and the others would have no tale to tell their own.